week, our lectionary dropped us off in the middle of 1 Kings, a book filled with grand, intense, awe-inspiring encounters between the forces of darkness and light, good and evil, to a magnitude worthy of a comic book or action movie. The chapter just before the one from which our Old Testament text comes from is a real superhero-level story. Drought has hit the land. The prophets of God are being killed left and right, all under the direction and rule of the wicked Queen Jezebel and her equally corrupt husband, King Ahab. The forces of evil seem to be prevailing. But then our champion emerges, the great prophet Elijah. And like all good superheroes, the prophet Elijah challenges the forces of darkness into an ultimate showdown, full of live-action stunts worthy of a Christopher Nolan movie. Elijah challenges the priests of the Canaanite deity, Baal, to the ultimate test. Each team will assemble an altar with the prepared sacrificial bull, but will have to call upon their own gods to light the fire. And, of course, the forces of darkness make their first move. They call upon Baal to accept their offering by lighting the fire. They cried out, they limped, they hurt themselves, they raved. But the Bible tells us there was no voice, no answer, and no response. Then it was Elijah's turn. He repaired the altar of the Lord and dug a deep trench around the altar. In a shocking turn of events, he then has helpers pour water all over the altar, so much so that everything is saturated. And there's so much water that it's pouring over the sides and fills the trenches. Then Elijah cries out to God. And as the text tells us, the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up the water that was in the trench. Soon after, the prophets of Baal were taken down into the desert and were defeated. As a bonus, God even brought down the rains and ended the drought. Good had finally won. Well, sort of. Elijah, after this fiery display, had quite the target on his back. Queen Jezebel was going to make sure that he, too, was slaughtered. And so, Elijah flees. Because the reality is that Elijah isn't actually a superhero. He was never bitten by a radioactive spider. He wasn't sent to Earth in a spaceship from the planet Krypton. He wasn't a wealthy person with all the world's best technology at his disposal. I think it's easy when we hear some of the greatest hit Bible stories, like David facing off against Goliath, Moses parting the Red Sea, Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, Esther saving her people. Well, it's easy to put these stories in the category of superhero stories. But the reality is that all these persons were regular people. Elijah, like everyone else God has chosen to call, was a regular person, a human. Our text today ushers us towards Mount Horeb, the Mount of God, also known as Mount Sinai. Yes, this is the same mountain where, in another dramatic show of God's strength and faithfulness, a pillar of fire had led the people of God in the Exodus, and Moses had received the 10 Commandments. But that's not why Elijah is there. Elijah has hit rock bottom. And don't get me wrong, Elijah is in a pretty bad way. He's being hunted down. But there's also another element to this story. Because how much harder does the valley feel when you've just been on the top of the mountain, he's gone from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. And perhaps in less extreme ways, we might at times feel that same pain too. When we witness dramatic, powerful manifestations of God in whatever form, well, we might train ourselves to only notice God's presence in those big, extreme ways. It's a bit like walking out of a movie theater into the hallway. After sitting in the dark room with our eyes glued to a very bright screen and our ears surrounded by loud surround sound for an extended period of time, when we enter into the far quieter and less flashy hallway, our senses have to adjust. And with spiritual senses dulled, we may only notice God in big ways. Perhaps we hear a powerful, forceful testimony of God's presence in the life of our neighbor, and we might become jealous or wonder why God didn't show up for us in that way. Or on the other end, maybe we ourselves had that sort of mountaintop experience like Elijah did at the altar of the Lord. Maybe it was a radical conversion, an adrenaline-boosting Christian conference or concert, or a particularly powerful workshop at diocesan convention. Hey, I won't rule out the last one. But what goes up must come down. And we descend that mountain, and everything becomes less clear, less loud, less obvious. Either way, we find ourselves at times wandering in the wilderness, in the valley. In the case of Elijah, he laid down in the valley and did not want to go any farther. But God guided him to another mountain, the one even called the Mount of God. And God told Elijah that he was coming by again. Perhaps Elijah will have another mountaintop experience and give him another spiritual high. A great wind came, so powerful it split rocks. That is fodder for another powerful encounter with God. And yet we're told that God was not in the wind. The same happens with an earthquake, and then with fire. Well, between the pillar of fire, the burning bush, and the fire Elijah called down, God must be in the fire, right? But God wasn't. And as our translation puts it, the fire is followed by sheer silence. Hebrew is a tricky language to translate because so many words have multiple upon multiple meanings. But a particularly popular translation is, rather than being sheer silence, Elijah heard a still, small voice. It's not a booming voice that greets Elijah. Instead, this still, small voice asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" That isn't a voice filled with power and great display. It's a voice of compassion, tenderness, and infinite care. It's the same voice that, centuries later, greeted terrified and exhausted disciples and friends in their storm-battered boat with the words, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." After God asks Elijah what he's doing here, Elijah pours his heart out, telling God that he's given his all, but everything is falling apart. Everywhere he looks, people are turning away, and now he's both hunted and dreadfully alone. And God tells him that there's a way through this. There is a way forward and work to be done, but God also tells Elijah that he's not alone. The work will go on, but he'll be joined by many others. There are still faithful, numbering in the thousands, and Elijah would soon anoint his successor, who both would take on the mantle of his work when he was done, and would be a companion traveling alongside Elijah throughout the rest of Elijah's journey. He wouldn't be alone again. This is, if you will, a recommissioning of Elijah. And perhaps this is what Elijah's story ultimately teaches us about the character, the nature of God. God is not only found in the spectacular. God is also found in the quiet. God is not only found in moments when everything is going right. God also comes to us when everything has fallen apart. God is not only the God who sends fire from heaven, but is also the God who sits with us in the wilderness and asks gently, "What are you doing here?" And we know this God because we have seen this same God revealed in Jesus Christ. The God who came not with the force of an army, but as a vulnerable child. The God who did not remain on the mountaintop, but came down into the valleys of human life with us. The Christ who entered into our suffering, our fear, our loneliness, and even our death, and showed us that even that is not the end. And when the disciples found themselves terrified in the storm, Jesus did not only give them a spectacular demonstration of power, he spoke to them. "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." That is the voice of God. And perhaps it's the voice we need to hear as we find ourselves in our own wildernesses or stormy seas. Take heart. You are not alone. God is still here, and there is still a way forward. Amen.